On the evening of July 5th, 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese slipped out of the apartment she shared with her parents in Star City, West Virginia. The summer air was thick and heavy, the kind of night when teenagers chased freedom under the stars. Skylar was bright, witty, and full of ambition. She dreamed of becoming a criminal lawyer one day, loved reading, and was known for her sharp sense of humor. Though just 16, she carried herself with maturity, confident in her opinions and unafraid to speak her mind. She was also deeply loyal to her friends, especially her two closest companions, Sheila, Eddy, and Rachel Shoaf. To anyone on the outside, the three girls looked inseparable. They shared selfies, secrets, and endless inside jokes, the kind of teenage bond that seemed unbreakable. They were best friends in every sense of the word, spending weekends together, sneaking out at night, and confiding in one another about school crushes and future plans. But beneath the surface, cracks had started to form. Skylar had begun to feel excluded, sensing that Sheila and Rachel were pulling away from her. Sometimes she was left out of plans. Sometimes the other two seemed to be keeping secrets. Still, Skylar clung to the friendship, hoping things would smooth over. She couldn't have known that her trust was being misplaced in the worst possible way. That night, when Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window and into the backseat of Sheila Eddy's car, she thought she was joining her two best friends for another harmless night of fun. Sheila and Rachel greeted her with easy smiles, masking the darkness of their intentions. They drove out of town, winding along back roads and rural highways, music spilling from the speakers, the warm night air rushing through open windows. For Skylar, it must have felt like countless nights before. Her friends, the open road, and the promise of adventure. But in the back of their minds, Sheila and Rachel were carrying out a plan they had been discussing for weeks. At some point, the two had come to a chilling conclusion. They didn't want to be friends with Skylar anymore. To most teenagers, that might mean a falling out, a few cruel words, or a silent drift apart. For Sheila and Rachel, it meant something far more sinister. They decided the only way to rid themselves of Skylar was to kill her. It was a decision so brutal, so senseless, that even years later, people still struggle to comprehend it. After about half an hour of driving, the girls crossed the Pennsylvania state line. They eventually parked on a remote stretch of road surrounded by woods. Skylar, unaware of what was coming, stepped out of the car with them. Together, they wandered into the dark, carrying with them knives they had hidden in their clothes. At first, it must have seemed like a normal detour, three girls giggling in the moonlight. But then, in a sudden burst of violence, Sheila and Rachel lunged at Skylar. They stabbed her again and again as she screamed, crying out in shock and betrayal. Her pleas for them to stop went unanswered. The two girls, her best friends, the ones she trusted most, continued until Skylar collapsed to the ground, her life slipping away in the quiet Pennsylvania woods. When it was over, Sheila and Rachel left her body in the brush, covered loosely with branches and dirt. Then they got back into the car, wiped their knives clean, and drove away as though nothing had happened. For them, it was done. They had carried out their plan. Skylar was gone. Back in Star City, Skylar's parents woke the next morning to find her missing. At first, they thought maybe she was at a friend's house or had overslept. But as the hours passed, worry grew into panic. Her bedroom window was open, the screen removed, a sign she had snuck out. When her parents checked with Sheila, she calmly told them she had dropped Skylar off at the end of the street around midnight, insisting she didn't know what had happened after that. Rachel echoed the same story. Both girls appeared concerned, even helping to spread flyers and post messages about Skylar's disappearance. For weeks, investigators searched for Skylar. Her parents went on television pleading for information, holding on to hope that their daughter would come home. Sheila even tweeted about missing her friend, carefully maintaining the appearance of innocence. But as police dug deeper, doubts began to form. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex showed Skylar getting into Sheila's car that night, but never returning. Witnesses reported seeing Sheila and Rachel together, their stories too rehearsed, too consistent. Investigators began to suspect that Skylar's closest friends knew more than they were saying. The turning point came months later in December 2012 when Rachel broke down. Overcome with guilt and fear, she confessed the truth to police. She and Sheila had killed Skylar. The motive, she admitted, was chillingly simple. When asked why they had done it, Rachel's answer was blunt and devastating. We just didn't like her. With Rachel's confession, the horrifying truth emerged. Detectives listened in disbelief as she described how they had lured Skylar out, driven her across state lines, and stabbed her in the woods. Following her directions, police finally located Skylar's remains in January 2013, 6 months after she had disappeared. The discovery shattered her parents, who had clung desperately to the hope that she might still be alive. The community, too, was left reeling. The idea that two teenage girls, bright, popular, seemingly normal, could so coldly kill their best friend over something as trivial as dislike was almost impossible to grasp. Skylar's murder drew national attention, sparking conversations about teenage dynamics, peer pressure, and the hidden cruelty that sometimes simmers beneath the surface of adolescent friendships. At trial, Rachel Shoaf pled guilty to second-degree murder and testified against Sheila. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Sheila Eddy, who maintained her composure even as evidence mounted, eventually pled guilty to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. For Skylar's parents, the sentences provided some measure of justice, but little comfort. They had lost their only child, a bright young girl with dreams of the future, to the senseless betrayal of the people she trusted most. In the aftermath, they channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for changes in state law. One result was Skylar's Law, legislation that made it mandatory to issue an immediate Amber Alert for any missing child, even if the child was believed to be a runaway. It was a way of ensuring that Skylar's story might prevent other families from enduring the same nightmare. Even now, years later, the murder of Skylar Neese remains one of the most shocking examples of teenage violence in America. It wasn't committed by strangers or by adults preying on a child. It was orchestrated by the very friends she trusted with her secrets, the girls she laughed with, the ones who knew her better than anyone. That betrayal, that intimate cruelty, is what makes the case so haunting. Skylar's final moments were spent in confusion, fear, and pain, inflicted not by enemies, but by the people she believed loved her most. In the end, the tragedy of Skylar Neese is not only about the brutality of her death, but about the fragility of trust. Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that danger does not always come from outside. It can come from within the circle of friendship itself. And for her parents, her community, and all who hear her story, it remains a wound that time can never fully heal. On a chilly November evening in 1997, in the quiet Canadian city of Victoria, British Columbia, 14-year-old Rena Virk left her home after a small argument with her parents. Like so many teenagers, she was struggling to fit in, searching for a place where she belonged. Rena was the daughter of Indian immigrant parents who were part of the Jehovah's Witness faith, a background that sometimes set her apart from her peers. At school, she was teased for her looks, for her weight, for her differences. She longed for acceptance, for friendship, for the kind of belonging that teenagers crave most of all. And in that desire, she found herself drawn into a group of girls who seemed to offer exactly what she wanted: companionship, laughter, and a place in their circle. But behind the smiles and the invitations, that circle was dangerous. The girls she spent time with were known for bullying, for drinking, for violence simmering just beneath the surface. Rena ignored the red flags, desperate to be liked, desperate to be included. That Friday night, when she was invited to a small gathering by the Gorge Waterway, she felt excited. Maybe this was her chance to be part of something bigger than herself. She didn't know that the invitation was not about friendship at all. It was a trap. At first, the gathering looked like so many teenage get-togethers: kids smoking, drinking, talking, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. Words were exchanged, whispers passed between the girls. Rena became the focus of their anger. One of them accused her of trying to steal another girl's boyfriend, of spreading rumors. The accusations quickly turned into violence. One by one, several girls surrounded Rena. They taunted her, shoved her, and began beating her. They pushed her to the ground, kicked her, and stubbed cigarettes out on her forehead. For many kids, a fight ends when one person goes down, when the message of dominance has been delivered. But here the violence didn't stop. Rena, terrified and outnumbered, tried to defend herself, but she was overwhelmed. Some witnesses would later say the attack lasted for minutes that felt like hours, a relentless cycle of punches and kicks that left the 14-year-old dazed and bloodied. Eventually, the group scattered, leaving Rena bruised, humiliated, and staggering toward the bridge. It could have ended there. Rena might have survived the night, carrying scars but still alive. But two of the girls stayed behind, 16-year-old Kelly Allard and 15-year-old Warren Glowatsky. Together, they followed Rena as she limped toward the bridge. When they caught up with her, the violence resumed. They beat her again, more brutally this time. Then in a final act of cruelty, they dragged her toward the water and forced her head beneath the surface until she drowned. Alone, helpless, Rena's life ended in the gorge waterway that night, betrayed by the very people she had wanted so desperately to call friends. When Rena didn't come home, her parents reported her missing. At first, it was treated like a possible runaway case. Rena had argued with her parents before, and to investigators it seemed plausible that she had stormed off to cool down. But as days passed with no word, no sign of her, worry turned into dread. On November 22nd, just over a week later, the worst fears came true. Her body was discovered floating in the water near the bridge, swollen from days of submersion, the marks of a savage beating visible even after death. The discovery sent shockwaves through Victoria. It wasn't just that a teenage girl had been murdered, it was the brutality of it, the sheer senselessness of the act, and the fact that it was carried out by her peers. Rena wasn't killed by strangers or by adults preying on a child. She had been beaten and drowned by the same people she had desperately wanted to accept her. The community struggled to comprehend how kids, just kids, could be capable of such cruelty. The police investigation moved quickly. Dozens of teens had been at the gathering by the waterway. Rumors swirled through schools, and soon enough, names began to surface. Witnesses came forward, describing the beating, the cigarettes stubbed out on Rena's forehead, the way the group turned on her. Several girls were charged with assault in connection to the initial attack. But the murder case focused on two individuals, Kelly Allard and Warren Glowatsky. Glowatsky, just 15 at the time, admitted his role. He confessed to being part of the attack that led to Rena's death. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Over time, he would express remorse, seeking forgiveness from Rena's family, and eventually earning parole. Kelly Allard's case dragged on much longer. She was charged with second-degree murder, but her first trial in 2000 ended in a conviction that was overturned on appeal. A second trial in 2004 also resulted in a conviction, but again it was overturned. Finally, in 2005, during her third trial, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Allard's attitude throughout the proceedings drew anger. She was often defiant, unapologetic, and seemingly unrepentant. To many, she embodied the coldness and cruelty that had defined that night. For Rena's family, the trials were an agonizing process, reopening wounds again and again. They had already endured the unbearable loss of their daughter. Now they had to sit in courtrooms, listening to the details of her murder repeated, debated, and picked apart. The Verks were quiet, private people, but they became reluctant public figures, speaking out about bullying, racism, and the vulnerability of children who feel like outsiders. Their grief was a weight they carried with dignity, even as the legal system forced them to relive their daughter's final moments over and over. The murder of Rena Verk struck a chord across Canada. It wasn't just the horror of the crime, but what it revealed about adolescence, the cruelty of cliques, the desperation to belong, the ease with which peer pressure can turn into violence. Teachers, parents, and communities were forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How could so many kids witness the attack and do nothing to stop it? How could teenagers justify, even to themselves, the brutality they inflicted on a girl who only wanted their friendship? Years later, Glowatsky would sit down with Rena's parents and apologize. He acknowledged his role, admitted his guilt, and expressed regret. In time, Rena's family offered him forgiveness. For them, it was a way of freeing themselves from the weight of hatred. But Kelly Ellard, who later began going by the name Carrie Marie Sim, took much longer to admit responsibility. It wasn't until she applied for parole, years into her sentence, that she finally acknowledged her role in Rena's death. By then, the damage was long done. Today, the bridge over the Gorge waterway still stands. People cross it every day, unaware that beneath its surface lies the memory of a young girl whose life was cut short by betrayal. For those who know the story, it is a haunting reminder of how fragile adolescence can be, how the desire to belong can sometimes lead a child into the darkest of places. Rena Verk was only 14 years old when she died. She should have had decades ahead of her, time to grow, to change, to find her place in the world. Instead, her life ended beneath the water, at the hands of those she thought might finally let her in. Her story remains one of Canada's most notorious cases of teenage violence, not only because of the brutality, but because of the chilling truth it reveals. Sometimes, the greatest danger is not from strangers lurking in the shadows, but from the very friends we hope will stand beside us. On the night of January 10th, 1992, in the small town of Madison, Indiana, 12-year-old Shanda Scherer prepared for what she thought would be an ordinary evening. She was in 7th grade, full of energy, known for her bright smile and playful nature. Shanda was new to town, having recently moved there with her mother, and like so many kids her age, she was eager to fit in. She had made friends quickly, joined the school band, and even developed a crush on another girl, which at the time in a conservative community was not something easily accepted. That crush would ignite a chain of jealousy and rage that ended in one of the most shocking cases of juvenile violence the country had ever seen. At the center of the storm was Shanda's budding relationship with Amanda Heverin, a fellow student. Their connection was innocent, the kind of puppy love common in adolescence. But it drew the attention of Amanda's ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Melinda Lovelace. Melinda was older, volatile, and fiercely possessive. She could not accept that Amanda was moving on, let alone with someone younger and new to town. Her jealousy boiled into obsession. She spoke openly about her hatred for Shanda, threatening her, plotting ways to scare her off. What began as teenage rivalry soon darkened into something much more sinister. On that January evening, Melinda set her plan in motion. She enlisted the help of 3 other girls, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. Each came from troubled backgrounds marked by abuse, neglect, and instability. Together, they formed a dangerous alliance, feeding off one another's anger and recklessness. Melinda's goal was to confront Shanda, to intimidate her into leaving Amanda alone. But beneath that stated motive lurked a desire for violence that none of the girls seemed willing to resist. That night, the group of 4 drove to Shanda's house. It was late, and Shanda's mother was asleep. Melinda and the others knocked on the door and persuaded Shanda to come with them, telling her that Amanda wanted to meet her at a place called the Witch's Castle, a ruined stone house outside of town with a reputation for being haunted. The idea of seeing Amanda was enough to lure Shanda out, despite the late hour. She slipped on her coat and followed them into the car, unaware that she was stepping into a nightmare from which she would never return. As they drove, Melinda revealed a knife, taunting Shanda, telling her exactly who she was, the jealous ex-girlfriend. Shanda's fear grew, but the girls reassured her that nothing serious would happen. When they arrived at the witch's castle, they dragged her inside, mocking her. threatening her, brandishing the knife as they described in graphic detail what they might do. Shonda begged them to let her go, her voice trembling in the cold night air. At first, it seemed like it might end there, with nothing more than intimidation. But Melinda's rage had been unleashed, and Lori, Hope, and Tony were swept along in its momentum. They forced Shanda back into the car and drove aimlessly, arguing about what to do. Hours passed as the night stretched on. At one point, they stopped at Lori's house, where the situation grew darker. The girls tied Shanda up, taunted her, and threatened her again with the knife. Shanda cried, pleading for her life, but her captors showed no mercy. Instead, they escalated their cruelty, feeding off one another's energy, the boundaries of decency and humanity slipping further away. Eventually, they decided to end it. They drove Shanda to a remote location, dragged her out of the car, and attacked her. She was beaten, stabbed, and strangled, but the girl's brutality did not stop there. In the early hours of the morning, they stuffed her into the trunk of the car, where she clung desperately to life. Even then, her muffled cries could be heard from the back as they drove around, stopping occasionally to check if she was still alive. In the quiet town of Madison, Indiana, people still remember Shanda. They remember her laughter, her bright energy, and the way her life was stolen too soon. Her story lingers as one of the darkest chapters in the history of juvenile crime, a chilling example of what can happen when jealousy, rage, and peer pressure converge in the worst possible way. On the night of June 4th, 1999, in the small town of Perry, Oklahoma, 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman was driving her new Chevy pickup truck with her friend, a young woman named Summer. Stephanie had just graduated high school, and her future was bright. She was a diligent student, a loyal friend, and the kind of daughter any parent would be proud of. She worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and carried herself with quiet determination. That night, she had agreed to give Summer a ride to a house where another girl was staying. It was meant to be a simple favor, the kind of thing friends do for each other without a second thought. But as she pulled up to the house on Elm Street, Stephanie unknowingly stepped into a nightmare that would end her life. Inside the house lived 24-year-old Clayton Lockett, a man with a history of violence, burglary, and cruelty. He was already a wanted criminal, his life marked by anger and reckless choices. Lockett, along with his accomplices Sean Mathis and Bobby Bland, had been planning a robbery and were armed and ready for violence. When Stephanie and Summer arrived, the three men saw an opportunity. Almost immediately, Stephanie and her friend were confronted. Lockett and the others forced their way into the situation, brandishing weapons, barking orders. Summer was terrified, trying to keep calm as the men tied both girls up with duct tape. Stephanie, however, refused to be intimidated. She had always been strong-willed, raised to stand firm in her principles. She made it clear she wasn't going to give in to whatever they demanded. The men dragged the girls into the house, where chaos unfolded. Lockett and his accomplices terrorized them, waving guns, demanding submission. Stephanie resisted every step of the way. At one point, she refused to give them the keys to her new truck, insisting it was hers and that they had no right to it. Her refusal enraged Lockett. He was not used to being defied, especially by a teenage girl. The more she resisted, the angrier he became. Lockett, Mathis, and Bland escalated their violence. Summer was beaten, threatened, and sexually assaulted in the house. Stephanie was forced to watch, still refusing to break. The men tied them both up again and shoved them into the back of Stephanie's truck. They drove the girls, along with another young woman who had been caught up in the ordeal, out to a remote area in rural Kay County. The night was dark and quiet, the truck's headlights cutting through the emptiness of the Oklahoma back roads. When they arrived, the terror reached its peak. The men dragged Stephanie from the truck, forcing her to the ground. Lockett produced a shotgun and demanded that she give up the keys to her vehicle. Even then, in the face of a loaded weapon, Stephanie stood her ground. She said no. She told him the truck was hers and she wasn't going to let him take it. Her refusal was an act of courage, but it sealed her fate. Lockett grew furious. In that moment, he decided she would die. The men forced Stephanie to kneel as they began digging a shallow grave. They told her what was coming, taunting her with the knowledge that she was about to be killed. Summer, bound and terrified, could only watch as her best friend's final moments unfolded. Lockett taunted Stephanie one last time, offering her the chance to beg for her life, but Stephanie refused. She would not plead. She would not give him the satisfaction. She was resolute until the end. Then, as the grave lay open before her, Lockett raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast tore into Stephanie, silencing her voice forever. The men dumped her body into the hole and covered it with dirt. In the silence of that Oklahoma field, a 19-year-old girl's life was extinguished, snuffed out by the cruelty of men who saw her defiance as a challenge to their control. For her family, the nightmare began when Stephanie never came home. Her parents, Doug and Susie, reported her missing, their worry growing with every passing hour. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. Summer, though traumatized, survived the ordeal. Her testimony provided the details of what had happened that night: the abduction, the assault, the drive into the countryside, and the horrifying execution of her best friend. The investigation quickly identified the suspects. Clayton Lockett was arrested, along with Sean Mathis and Bobby Bland. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Lockett had not only killed Stephanie, but he had also boasted about it afterward. His cruelty extended beyond the crime itself. He seemed to revel in what he had done. The trials were harrowing for Stephanie's family. They sat in court, listening to the details of their daughter's final hours, forced to confront the unimaginable reality of her suffering. Prosecutors described Lockett as cold-blooded, a man with no remorse. The jury agreed. In 2000, Clayton Lockett was convicted of murder, rape, kidnapping, and other charges. He was sentenced to death. Matisse and Bland received life sentences for their roles in the crime. For years, Stephanie's parents lived with the knowledge that the man who had killed their daughter sat on death row. They waited for justice, carrying the weight of their grief as the appeals dragged on. Finally, in 2014, Lockett's execution was scheduled, but even in death, his cruelty seemed to leave a stain. On April 29, 2014, Clayton Lockett was strapped to a gurney in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was scheduled to die by lethal injection, but the procedure went horribly wrong. The drugs were administered improperly, and instead of slipping quietly into unconsciousness, Lockett writhed in pain for 43 minutes, groaning, clenching his teeth, and straining against the restraints as the lethal chemicals slowly coursed through his body. Witnesses described the scene as gruesome, chaotic, and disturbing. Eventually, the blinds were lowered, blocking the view from journalists and observers. 43 minutes after it began, Lockett was declared dead. The botched execution sparked national debate about the death penalty and the methods used to carry it out. Some argued it was cruel and unusual punishment. Others, including Stephanie's family, saw it as a fitting end for a man who had shown no mercy to their daughter. For Doug and Susie Neiman, the ordeal was not about politics or procedure. It was about the girl they had lost, the daughter they would never see again, the hole in their family that could never be filled. Stephanie Neiman's murder remains one of the most chilling reminders of how quickly an ordinary night can turn into tragedy. She was 19, on the cusp of adulthood with dreams of the future. She did nothing to deserve what happened. Her only crime was her refusal to be intimidated, her unwillingness to hand over what was hers. That defiance, that courage, cost her her life. Today, Stephanie's story lives on as both a warning and a legacy, It is a warning of the dangers that lurk in unexpected places, of the monsters who walk among us, and it is a legacy of courage, a reminder that even in her final moments, she refused to surrender her dignity. She faced down evil, and though it cost her everything, she left this world with her pride intact. For those who hear her story, the haunting question lingers. What would we have done in her place? Would we have given in, handed over the keys, pleaded for mercy? Or would we, like Stephanie Neiman, have refused to bow to cruelty, even in the face of death? It is a question without easy answers, but it ensures that her story will never be forgotten. In the quiet suburban town of Carlisle, Ohio, life in 2017 carried the same rhythms as many small communities across America. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, where news traveled quickly, and where appearances mattered. Among its young residents was Brooke Skylar Richardson, known to most as Skylar. At 18 years old, she appeared to embody the image of a typical American teenager. She was petite, blonde, and seemingly shy, with a passion for cheerleading and dreams of attending college. To her parents and those in her circle, she was the reserved, polite girl who often smiled politely, but rarely shared much about her private life. What most people didn't realize was that beneath her quiet demeanor, Skylar carried a secret that would eventually shatter not only her own life, but also ripple across her community, igniting national headlines and furious debate about justice, morality, and truth. In May 2017, just 2 days after attending her senior prom, Skylar visited her gynecologist for a routine birth control consultation. During the exam, the doctor discovered that Skylar had recently given birth. The revelation shocked not only the doctor, but also Skylar's parents, who were sitting in the waiting room. They had no idea their daughter had been pregnant. She had concealed the pregnancy so well that no one around her, not her parents, not her friends, not even the boy she had dated casually, suspected anything. Confronted by the doctor's questions, Skylar admitted that she had given birth at home alone in her bathroom in the early hours of May 7th. The baby, she said, was a girl, but what happened next, according to Skylar's initial account, set off a firestorm. She told investigators that the baby had been stillborn, that she never breathed, and that in a panic, she buried the infant in her backyard. For law enforcement, the story raised immediate red flags. A teenage girl pregnant in secret, giving birth alone and burying the remains without telling a soul? It sounded like a textbook case of neonaticide when a mother kills her newborn within hours of delivery. Within days, police descended on the Richardson home. They brought shovels, cadaver dogs, and forensic experts. In the family's backyard in a shallow grave, they found the remains of a newborn girl, later identified as Skylar's child. The discovery ignited shockwaves. Reporters swarmed the quiet street, neighbors whispered in disbelief, and the nation soon learned the name Brooke Skylar Richardson. To the public, the narrative seemed obvious. A cheerleader from a small town had become pregnant, concealed it, and killed her baby to protect her reputation. Police interrogated Skylar for hours, and their questions became increasingly pointed. Initially, Skylar maintained that the baby was stillborn, but under pressure, she appeared to adjust her story, at times suggesting the child may have shown signs of life before she panicked. Detectives latched on to this inconsistency. Prosecutors argued that Skylar had killed her baby to preserve her perfect life image, fearing the judgment of her family and peers if her pregnancy became known. By July 2017, Skylar was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and abuse of a corpse. The charges were as serious as they come, with the possibility of life in prison if she were convicted of murder. The trial that followed became a media spectacle. On one side, prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of a young woman obsessed with appearances, someone who would go to extreme lengths to avoid shame. They pointed to text messages Skylar had sent in the days after the birth. Messages about losing weight and celebrating the fact that her stomach was flat again. To the prosecution, these were not the words of a grieving mother, but of someone relieved to erase the evidence of her pregnancy. On the other side, the defense argued that Skylar was a scared teenager who had given birth alone, believing the baby was stillborn. They emphasized her history of eating disorders and mental health struggles, suggesting she was more naive than calculating. Forensic experts were brought in to analyze the baby's remains, but the condition of the body after months underground made it nearly impossible to determine whether the child had been born alive or dead. The prosecution's claim that the baby had been burned, a suggestion based on an early misinterpretation of forensic findings, was later discredited. As the trial unfolded in September 2019, the courtroom became the stage for a deeply divisive story. On one hand, there was the tragic image of a newborn buried in a backyard, her life cut short before it could begin. On the other, there was a teenager on trial for murder, whose guilt or innocence depended almost entirely on interpretation rather than clear-cut evidence. For Skylar's parents, the ordeal was agonizing. They sat behind their daughter, supporting her, while also facing the judgment of a community that looked at them with suspicion and disdain. For the Neiman family, who had once been proud of their cheerleader daughter, life had become a nightmare. The jury deliberated for several hours, weighing the limited evidence against the emotional weight of the accusations. In the end, they acquitted Skylar of the most serious charges, including aggravated murder and involuntary manslaughter. The evidence, they concluded, was simply too uncertain to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the baby had been born alive and that Skylar had caused her death. However, she was convicted of gross abuse of a corpse for burying the remains in her backyard. For that, she was sentenced to 3 years of probation. The verdict ignited fierce debate across the country. Some saw Skylar as a cold, calculating killer who had escaped justice. Others saw her as a tragic figure, a teenager overwhelmed by fear and secrecy, punished more by the weight of her circumstances than by the law. For the community of Carlisle, the case left scars that have not fully healed. Neighbors still recall the police digging in the Richardsons' backyard, the flood of media vans that turned their quiet street into a spectacle, and the unsettling questions the case raised. Could anyone truly know what happened in that bathroom? Was the baby stillborn, as Skylar claimed, or did she take her daughter's life to protect her own? Even years later, the story of Brooke Skylar Richardson lingers as one of the most haunting and controversial true crime cases of the decade. It is a story of secrecy, of the crushing weight of societal expectations, and of the fragile line between truth and perception. The haunting question remains: when a young woman hides her pregnancy, gives birth alone, and buries her child in secret, how do we separate fear from guilt? Was Skylar a victim of her own naivety, or was she a killer hiding behind silence? The answers remain buried in that backyard, with a tiny life that never had the chance to begin. On a humid April night in 2011, in the small town of Summerfield, Florida, a teenage boy named Seth Jackson sat at home, scrolling through his phone. At just 15 years old, Seth was known for his boyish smile, his easygoing charm, and his ambitions of becoming a mixed martial arts fighter. He was popular among friends, close to his family, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who still believed the future was wide open. But like many teenagers, his world was complicated by the volatility of young love and friendships that blurred into rivalries. That night, a text message appeared on his phone, and it would set into motion the last hours of his life. The message came from a girl he had once cared for deeply, Amber Wright. She was also 15, and for a time, she and Seth had been inseparable. Their relationship had been intense, as teenage love often is, but it had ended bitterly. Their breakup had spiraled into fights, jealousy, and public arguments across Facebook, where accusations of cheating and betrayal spilled into the open for their peers to see. Still, despite the anger, there remained the tangled emotions of first love, feelings that made Seth vulnerable when Amber reached out. She wanted to meet, she said. She wanted to talk, to smooth things over. Seth, still nursing feelings for her, agreed. It seemed harmless enough. After all, this was a girl he had once trusted. He had no way of knowing that Amber's text was a trap. Behind the scenes, Amber was part of a circle of friends consumed by rage, jealousy, and resentment. Chief among them was her new boyfriend, Michael Bargo, an 18-year-old with a reputation for volatility and a simmering hatred for Seth. Michael couldn't stand the idea that Amber and Seth still communicated, and in his mind, the solution was brutal and final. He convinced Amber, along with friends Charlie Ely, Kyle Hooper, and Justin Soto, to lure Seth into a deadly ambush. That night, Seth agreed to meet Amber at Charlie Ely's home, a modest house tucked away in Summerfield. He believed he was going to reconcile, maybe even rekindle a connection. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. When Seth arrived, Amber greeted him, playing her part. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary. Then, in an instant, Michael Bargo and the others emerged. They attacked Seth viciously, punching, kicking, and pistol whipping him as Amber watched. The blows came hard and fast, fueled by rage and cruelty. Seth fought back, but he was outnumbered, trapped in a house where every door was a barrier, every window a dead end. The violence escalated beyond comprehension. Seth was beaten, then shot. He collapsed, bleeding, his cries echoing through the small home. The group dragged him into the bathroom, where he pleaded for his life, but mercy was not part of their plan. Michael Bargo, determined to end it, fired the fatal shot to Seth's face. Even death did not end the brutality. In the hours that followed, the group set about destroying Seth's body. They stuffed him into a sleeping bag, carried him to a backyard fire pit, and burned his remains, feeding the flames with wood and anything they could find to make the fire blaze hotter. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air, carried into the night. What remained of Seth was reduced to ash and fragments of bone. The next day, Michael and his accomplices gathered the remains, scooping them into buckets, and dumped them into a nearby rock quarry, as though erasing a human life could be as simple as discarding trash. Seth's family, meanwhile, grew frantic. When he failed to return home, his parents began calling, searching, hoping for answers. His disappearance was reported to the police, and almost immediately, suspicion turned toward Amber and her circle of friends. Detectives interviewed the teenagers, and cracks in their stories quickly appeared. They were young, impulsive, and unable to maintain their lies under pressure. Within days, the horrifying truth emerged. Seth had been lured, murdered, burned, and discarded by the very people he thought were his friends. The revelation shattered Summerfield. How could teenagers commit something so monstrous? The brutality of the crime, the calculated deceit, and the sheer callousness left the community in shock. Seth's parents, Scott and Sonia, were devastated, their lives forever marked by grief. Their boy, who had once dreamed of stepping into a cage to fight for sport, had instead been slaughtered by people he had trusted. The trials that followed exposed the chilling details in full. Amber Wright, the girl who had once held Seth's heart, was revealed as the bait in a trap that led him to his death. Kyle Hooper and Justin Soto admitted their roles in the beating and disposal of the body. Charlie Ely's house was the setting for the nightmare, and though she initially claimed ignorance, her involvement became undeniable. But it was Michael Bargo, the ringleader, whose hatred drove the plan, who pulled the trigger, and who orchestrated the attempt to erase Seath from existence. In court, prosecutors described the crime in unflinching detail. They played recordings of interviews, presented physical evidence from the fire pit in the quarry, and showed the text messages that lured Seath to his fate. Jurors listened as the story unfolded, a tale not of spontaneous rage, but of premeditated cruelty. One by one, the perpetrators faced justice. Amber Wright, who was only 15 at the time of the murder, was sentenced to life in prison, though her sentence was later reduced to 40 years after appeal. Kyle Hooper and Justin Soto were also sentenced to life for their roles. Charlie Ely received a reduced sentence after a retrial, but spent years behind bars. Michael Bargo, however, was sentenced to death. The jury deemed him the mastermind, the one whose hatred had transformed teenage conflict into murder. For Seath's family, the verdicts brought some measure of justice, but no peace. His mother, Sonia, described the agony of losing her son in such a horrific way. His father, Scott, spoke of the emptiness left behind, the milestones Seath would never reach, the future stolen from him. The cruelty of the crime ensured that their grief would always carry the sharp edge of horror. The case captured national attention, not just because of its brutality, but because of the ages of those involved. These were teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, committing an act of violence so extreme it rivaled the darkest crimes of adults. It raised unsettling questions about the capacity for cruelty in the young, about how jealousy and manipulation could spiral into murder. Years later, the story of Seath Jackson continues to haunt. His name is remembered not for the life he lived, but for the betrayal he suffered. He trusted Amber. He believed in the possibility of reconciliation. That belief cost him everything. In Summerfield, the echoes of his murder still linger. The house where he was killed has long since been vacated, but for those who remember, its walls carry the memory of screams that once filled the night. The quarry, quiet and still, remains the place where fragments of a boy's life were discarded. And the fire pit where his body was burned stands as a chilling symbol of how far betrayal can go when fueled by hatred. The betrayal of Seath Jackson is more than a story of murder. It is a cautionary tale about trust, about the vulnerability of youth, and about the devastating consequences of jealousy allowed to fester unchecked. Seath's courage in his final moments, his fight against impossible odds, stands in contrast to the cowardice of those who destroyed him. For those who hear his story, the haunting question remains: how could friends, teenagers bound by the same small-town lives, plot and carry out such cruelty? The answer may never be enough to make sense of the loss. What endures is the image of a boy whose future was stolen, betrayed by the very people he once let into his heart.